Right now, your grocery bill in India is actually being directly manipulated by a single missile strike on a petrochemical plant in Iran.
Yeah, it sounds like an exaggeration, but it's really not.
No, it's not. We don't often think about the actual physical mechanisms that connect a localized conflict in West Asia to the cost of everyday goods.
Hmm.
But the global supply chain is just wound that tightly.
It is incredibly fragile.
Right. So today we are going to look under the hood of that global machine. Consider this deep dive your high yield briefing. We are basically acting as your virtual UPSC mentor and current affairs expert today.
Exactly. We've taken a massive stack of data.
Oh, massive. Everything from constitutional law shifts in India to global shipping choke points and even orbital mechanics.
And we are synthesizing it all into one cohesive picture so you can understand the friction of modern governance without the information overload.
But before we jump in, a quick baseline rule for this deep dive. We are dealing with some highly sensitive structural shifts today. Complex legal, religious, and geopolitical conflicts.
Right. So just to be absolutely clear to everyone listening, our mission here is strictly neutral. We're mapping out the mechanics. We'll impartially report the facts, the policies, and the different viewpoints exactly as they exist in our sources.
Yeah, we are not taking sides or endorsing any political stance. We just want you to understand how the system operates when it's under intense pressure.
Perfectly said.
Okay, so let's start right at the foundation of that system here in India, the evolving polity. Because the absolute core of governance is, well, how power and money are distributed between the center, the states, and the individual.
It always comes down to money and power, right?
Always. And if you look at the 16th Finance Commission's recommendations, this is for the 2026 to 2031 period, the entire architecture of fiscal federalism is shifting.
It really is. The divisible pool of taxes, which is the money legally shared between the center and the states, that pool is shrinking.
Right. But the real story, the thing you really need to pay attention to, is the fundamental transition in how the remaining funds are distributed.
This is a huge mechanism shift.
Yeah.
Historically, state governments have relied heavily on statutory grants. These are under Article 275 of the Constitution.
So Article 275 grants, those are basically constitutionally guaranteed transfers, right?
Exactly. They are based on assessed need and very specific, predictable criteria. So a state can build its long-term budget around that money because it knows, without a doubt, it's coming.
Right.
But the 16th Finance Commission is heavily signaling a pivot away from that, toward discretionary grants under Article 282.
Okay, I think a good analogy here is it's like a parent changing how they give an allowance.
Well, that's a good way to look at it.
Right. Instead of a guaranteed weekly amount that you can rely on, to buy your own groceries, which is Article 275, you now have to go to the parent, pitch a specific project, and just hope they approve the funding for it under Article 282.
Yeah, and that alters the entire power dynamic. Because Article 282 was originally intended for special, temporary public purposes.
Not everyday funding.
Exactly. But using it as a primary funding vehicle drastically strengthens the central government's discretion.
Now, the stated aim here officially is to strengthen local governance, isn't it?
Yes. By using discretionary grants, the center can bypass state capitals entirely. They can directly fund local bodies, like panchayats and municipalities, for highly specific infrastructure or welfare projects.
But the undeniable byproduct of that is that state governments are financially subordinated. I mean, they lose that unconditional capital, which directly restricts their autonomous policymaking power.
It limits their freedom, yeah.
And it's fascinating because while states are losing some of their financial autonomy to the center, they are simultaneously trying to assert their power over social dynamics within their own borders.
Right. We are seeing this intense friction between personal liberty and community traditions.
Take Karnataka's new social legislation, for example, the Evanava bill.
The title alone is so deeply symbolic. It translates to, he is ours, she is ours. And it draws directly from the philosophy of a 12th century Lingayat saint. His core teaching was basically the total rejection of rigid caste and community barriers in favor of a universal egalitarian kinship.
Which is a beautiful concept.
Yeah.
And translating that 12th century philosophy into modern law, this bill is laser focused on protecting interfaith couples and just adults who choose their own partners in general.
Right. It actively decriminalizes associated violence, which is often framed as honor killings or societal backlash.
And it sets up institutional mechanisms to protect these individuals from their own families or communities.
So it is a state government very assertively stepping in to say that an individual's right to choose their partner supersedes traditional community boundaries.
Yeah. But wait, how does this tension between state intervention like the Karnataka bill and the rights of religious denominations, how does that reflect the broader struggle of constitutional morality? Because we're seeing this play out in the Supreme Court right now, too.
You're talking about the Sabarimala review petitions?
Exactly. The court is reviewing its 2018 judgment about the entry of women aged 10 to 50 into the Sabarimala shrine.
Right, and to answer your question, this is the ultimate friction point between competing fundamental rights. It's how these institutions renegotiate boundaries.
Break that down for us. What are the specific competing rights here?
On one side, you have Article 25. That guarantees an individual's fundamental right to freely profess, practice, and propagate religion.
Okay, the individual right.
Yes. But on the other side, you have Article 26. This protects the rights of a religious denomination to manage its own affairs in matters of religion.
So it's individual freedom versus collective tradition.
Exactly. This forces the judiciary to actually define the boundaries of constitutional morality. How do you legally reconcile an individual's right to access a space for worship with the collective right of a deeply rooted religious tradition to maintain its historical practices?
It's incredibly complex.
It is. Whether we're looking at the Finance Commission, renegotiating state budgets, or Karnataka legislating relationship protections, or the Supreme Court weighing religious traditions, India's institutional boundaries are completely fluid right now.
They're constantly being tested and redrawn.
Exactly.
But, constitutional friction is a bit abstract. Let's look at how this friction physically manifests when we try to build the future.
The infrastructure push.
Yeah. We are watching India attempt to manage rapid, massive infrastructure growth against very hard, unforgiving environmental limits. It's a literal balancing act.
A very precarious one.
For sure. Let's take the draft Transit-Oriented Development, or POD, policy for Delhi. The mandate now requires developers to dedicate 20% of their land exclusively for affordable housing.
And there's a strict condition attached to that.
Right. This development must be within a 500-meter radius of metro or regional transit corridors.
It is a very aggressive push for urban density.
Yeah. What's the core logic there?
The logic of TOD is that if you force affordable, high-density living directly on top of public transit nodes, you fundamentally alter the geometry of a city.
You change how people move.
Right. You minimize daily commutes, you centralize civic services, and theoretically, you drastically reduce vehicular emissions.
Which Delhi desperately, desperately needs.
Absolutely.
And we see that regency in Delhi's new Winter Action Plan. It's a 15-point strategy targeting dust, stubble burning, and vehicular pollution.
But it seems like they are shifting tactics, right?
They are. They aren't just relying on reactive bans anymore. They're moving toward proactive environmental engineering.
Yeah. The plan mandates the planting of 3 million trees. 3 million. Yeah. And the creation of a massive e-waste park.
They are basically trying to engineer carbon sinks within the city limits.
Yeah.
It's a massive attempt at environmental mitigation to save the city's air quality.
Okay, but I have to push back on the broader policy logic here.
Okay, good. We are talking about planting 3 million trees to artificially create lungs for a choking capital city. But at the exact same time, the Supreme Court just refused to cancel the National Green Tribunal's clearance for the Wayanad twin-tube tunnel.
Right, down in Kerala.
Yes. We are boring a massive twin-tube highway tunnel straight through the Western Ghats. And the Western Ghats is one of the most ecologically fragile biodiversity hotspots on the entire planet.
It is incredibly sensitive.
So how do policymakers actually logically reconcile this? Cutting a massive tunnel through a fragile mountain ecosystem for a highway while desperately scrambling to plant millions of trees in Delhi because we have too much concrete.
I know, it looks completely contradictory on the surface.
Okay.
But you have to view urban and regional planning through the lens of sustainable capacity and historical timelines.
Okay, explain that.
Delhi's situation is the grim result of decades of sprawling, vehicle-dependent, unplanned growth. The 3 million trees and the TOD policy that is retroactive triage. They are trying to fix a broken historical system.
Okay, so it's damage control.
Exactly. Now, Wayanad represents a completely different stage of development. That region has been historically isolated, which severely stunts economic integration.
Right.
The twin-tube tunnel is an attempt to leapfrog that isolation. The policy calculation essentially accepts a severe, localized environmental cost in the Western Ghats in exchange for broader, long-term regional economic connectivity.
I see the timeline argument, but man, the friction between those two priorities, Environmental preservation and economic connectivity, it's immense.
It's the defining challenge of our era.
And speaking of leapfrogging to build capacity, let's talk about the energy required to power all this new infrastructure.
Right.
Because we just hit a monumental milestone in India's nuclear program.
We really did. The prototype fast breeder reactor, the PFBR at Kalpakkam, has officially started core loading.
This is a 500 megawatt electric facility.
Yes, and it fundamentally changes India's energy trajectory.
Okay, let's break down the mechanics for everyone listening. What does core loading actually mean in a physical, literal sense?
Sure. Core loading is the highly precise process of placing the initial nuclear fuel assemblies into the reactor vessel.
It's the prep work.
Exactly. It's the final physical step before initiating the first sustained controlled nuclear chain reaction. Once that core is loaded and the reaction goes critical, the plant is officially operational.
And the fuel they are loading into this specific reactor is what makes it so revolutionary, because the PFBR marks Stage 2 of India's 3-stage nuclear power program.
Right.
And it uses something called uranium-plutonium mixed oxide, or MOX fuel.
This is where the physics are just fascinating.
Yeah.
A standard nuclear reactor consumes fissile material and produces waste, right?
Right, that's the traditional model.
But a fast breeder reactor uses fast neutrons to sustain the fission process. And its specific design allows it to convert non-fissile uranium surrounding the core into fissile plutonium.
Wait, so it literally creates more fuel that it consumes?
Yes, it manufactures its own next-generation fuel while generating electricity.
That is incredible.
It is. And mastering this Stage 2 fast breeder technology is the critical bridge for India, because we have relatively modest uranium reserves, but we have some of the largest reserves of thorium in the world.
Ah, and thorium at Stage 3.
Precisely. Thorium is the key to Stage 3 of the nuclear program. So the successful core loading at Kalpakkam proves that the indigenous technology required to eventually transition our entire grid to thorium is viable.
Wow. And accelerating that domestic energy independence is not just an environmental goal, is it? It's a critical geopolitical imperative.
Absolutely. Because while we're building breeder reactors, our broader economy is still highly vulnerable to external supply chain shocks.
Which brings us right back to that missile strike we mentioned at the start of the deep dive.
Exactly. To understand our vulnerability, you have to look at West Asia. We hear a lot about the strategic framework of the Indo-Pacific right now.
It's the geopolitical buzzword.
Right. But geopolitically, the Indo-Pacific construct is completely incomplete if you don't factor in West Asia. It is the geographic hinge of global trade and energy.
And that hinge is volatile. I mean, we are seeing severe escalation between Israel and Iran.
Yes. The recent incident where Israel targeted an Iranian petrochemical plant, which was located at a major gas field, that is exactly the kind of localized event that triggers a massive global shockwave.
Walk us through that chain reaction. How does a strike on a plant hit our wallets?
When energy infrastructure in or near the Strait of Hormuz is struck, the immediate reaction is in the maritime insurance markets.
Oh, the premiums skyrocket.
Exactly. Premiums for shipping just go through the roof. Tankers get rerouted all the way around the Cape of Good Hope, which adds weeks to transit times.
And that creates a severe supply chain shock.
Right. It drives up input costs for manufacturing globally. Economists are explicitly drawing comparisons to the supply chain panic of the 1973 oil embargo.
Wow. So it's that immediate restriction of flow that causes the spike. And this instability is exactly why we are seeing China execute a massive diplomatic pivot right now.
Yes. China and Pakistan are actively proposing joint peace initiatives in West Asia.
Which is a shift, right? China is transitioning from acting purely as an economic investor to operating as a primary diplomatic power broker.
And they're doing this entirely out of self-preservation. Because China suffers from a severe geographic vulnerability. It's known as the Malacca dilemma.
Map that out for us. Why is the Strait of Malacca a dilemma for them?
So the Strait of Malacca is a very narrow waterway between Indonesia and Malaysia. A massive percentage of China's energy imports from West Asia and its manufactured exports to the rest of the world must pass through this single choke point.
Okay.
In the event of a global conflict, a rival navy with superior maritime projection could easily blockade that strait. If Malacca is closed, China's energy grid and export economy would choke within weeks.
So it's basically a geographical trap.
It is. And to solve it, China has spent years investing in the Belt and Road Initiative. They've been building overland pipelines and rail networks through Pakistan and Central Asia to directly access West Asia.
Completely bypassing the Strait of Malacca.
Exactly. But here's the catch. Those overland routes are entirely dependent on a stable West Asia. If West Asia descends into regional war, like an Israel-Iran escalation, China's alternative routes are useless. So they are rushing to fill the diplomatic vacuum left by Western powers, brokering peace deals because their economic survival depends on a stable overland route to the Middle East.
You know, it's like playing a massive high-stakes game of Risk, where West Asia is the board.
That's a perfect analogy.
Right. For years, China was just buying up properties and resources, quietly investing in infrastructure, but now they realize that owning the infrastructure doesn't matter if the board itself is on fire.
Exactly.
So they are actively trying to rewrite the diplomatic rules of the game to protect those investments. And if you are listening and wondering why you should care about a petrochemical plant in Iran, this is the chain reaction.
It all connects.
A strike in Iran disrupts shipping, which threatens China's energy flow, which forces China to rewrite diplomatic treaties to secure overland routes, which shifts global alliances, which eventually ripples all the way down to the inflation rate and the cost of goods right here in India. The global machine is completely interlocked.
Every single node affects the other. Geopolitics, energy infrastructure, and your local economy are all part of the exact same supply chain.
It's wild to think about, but, you know, while we are down here dealing with the intense friction of those supply chains and borders on Earth, human engineering is quietly transcending the ultimate border above us.
Yes, the Artemis II mission.
They just broke the record for the farthest human flight from Earth.
The scale of this achievement is just staggering. The Artemis II crew traveled 400,171 kilometers away from our planet.
I mean, that's a distance that's hard for the human brain to even conceptualize, 400,000 kilometers. But what I find so fascinating is the context of the record they broke.
The previous record.
Yeah. The previous record for the farthest human spaceflight was actually held by the Apollo 13 mission, set all the way back in April 1970.
It really highlights a profound contrast in the history of space exploration. Artemis II was a meticulously planned, cutting-edge mission, rightly.
Yeah.
It was designed to push the boundaries of deep space travel intentionally.
Right, whereas the Apollo 13 record was the exact opposite. It was a desperate accident.
Yes. Apollo 13 didn't go that far out because they wanted to explore deeper space.
No, after the oxygen tank exploded on the way to the moon, they obviously had to abort the landing. But they didn't have the engine power to simply turn the ship around and come home.
They had to use what's called a free return trajectory.
Which is essentially an orbital mechanics maneuver.
Right, exactly. Instead of braking, they used the moon's gravity to essentially slingshot their damaged spacecraft back toward Earth. And because they had to swing around the far side of the moon at a much higher altitude to catch that precise gravitational pull, they were pushed further out into space than any planned lunar landing mission ever would have gone.
It's absolutely wild to think that we are comparing today's cutting-edge, meticulously planned Artemis technology with a distance record that was set by accident during a survival maneuver over 50 years ago.
It's incredible. But, you know, space exploration is really the ultimate synthesis of everything we've dissected today.
How so?
Getting Artemis II 400,000 kilometers into space requires mastering the exact frictions we've been talking about. It is the ultimate test of federal funding and budget allocation, much like the battles over the Finance Commission.
Oh, that's true.
It requires overcoming immense physical and infrastructural limits, just like the engineering in the Western Ghats. And it relies on a flawless, incredibly fragile global supply chain of materials, much like the ones currently threatened in West Asia.
It really does tie everything together.
It proves that when the disparate gears of governance, economics, and infrastructure align, when that friction is properly managed, human ingenuity can quite literally reach the stars.
Man. Well, today we have really mapped the friction of progress.
We covered a lot of ground.
We did. We started at the foundation, watching the 16th Finance Commission fundamentally alter fiscal federalism, shifting power from guaranteed state funds to discretionary central grants. We saw the Supreme Court and state legislatures weighing the really heavy, complex balance between personal liberties, religious denomination rights, and community traditions.
We explored the literal friction of our physical environment, the inherent contradiction of boring massive tunnels through sensitive biodiversity hotspots, while simultaneously engineering carbon sinks, and building next-generation fast-breeder nuclear reactors to decarbonize our grid.
Right. And then we zoomed out to the global fault lines, tracing how a single localized strike in West Asia creates a supply chain shock that forces a superpower to pivot from an economic player to a diplomatic peace broker just to bypass a geographical choke point.
All before looking up at the fact that despite this incredibly chaotic, grinding machine on Earth,
Yeah.
human beings just flew further into the dark of space than ever before.
It is a system under immense pressure.
It is. But I want to leave everyone listening with a final, lingering question to ponder. A provocative thought that builds on what we've talked about.
Laid on us.
We discussed China aggressively trying to rewrite the diplomatic rules in West Asia to secure its overland supply chains against maritime shocks.
Right.
If China successfully establishes a diplomatic monopoly in that region, how drastically will India's timeline for Stage 3 nuclear energy, driven by that new reactor at Kalpakkam, need to adapt and accelerate so that our domestic grid isn't caught in the crossfire of the next 1973-style global energy shock?
Oof, that is the million-dollar question. If the global machine is being rewired, the timeline to secure our own independent power source is shrinking rapidly.
Exactly.
We started by talking about governance as a machine defined by its friction gears grinding against each other, but maybe that friction isn't a sign that the system is breaking down. The friction of constitutional debates, infrastructure challenges, and geopolitical maneuvering, maybe it's just the heat generated by a system that is relentlessly moving forward.
That's a great way to look at it.
Well, keep questioning the world around you, keep looking closely at the parts of the machine, and thank you for joining us on this custom, tailored deep dive.